Okay. Alrighty, good to see you all. As Ms. Pullman averred to, I was able to get quiz number 1 up on Canvas, so it will be available at 6 p.m. tomorrow. So make sure you take that, obviously. I don't think there's anything else to tell you. I've started, well, now that I think about it, under modules on the Canvas page, you'll find articles and links to things. I've started to put stuff up there now that I figured out how to do it and where to put it. I would have never thought to put it under modules. I thought I'd put it under media or maybe files, but no, under modules. So if you go under modules, you'll see there are a couple articles there, PDF files, and there are a couple of links to outside sites. When you click on the links, Canvas will probably not let you or take you directly to the site. It will say that it's blocked because it's an unsafe site or whatever. They're not unsafe sites. One of them is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I'm assuming Google says their security certificate's fine, so I'm assuming they're okay. But there is a link at the top of the page for the site. So even though it's going to show you maybe a gray box and say that, you're going to unsafe material, it might be blocked by Canvas. Canvas isn't actually blocking it. There's still a link there at the top of the page. If you click on the link, it'll take you directly to the web page, just so you know. Might actually send the links by an email as well, just to be on the safe side, in case people who aren't here don't know to do that. Okay, so we're continuing our very brief history of bioethics. And I ended with this gentleman, Hippocrates of Kos. I might not worry about that. I was talking about him. Not much is known about him. It's generally believed that he did exist, although we don't really have a lot of historical evidence for him other than people referring to the fact that he existed. So we'll assume we don't have direct evidence of Hippocrates. We don't have writings from him, apparently. But we do have indirect evidence that people knew him and knew of him. So he is the most famous physician of the ancient Western world, or we could also say the ancient world. As I said, little is known about him except some of the details that we do know that people mention are that he was a short man. Okay, that was something to take note of. He was short and he traveled a lot. So he didn't stay in one place. He traveled around, doing his doctorly duties and teaching. But even in antiquity, the nature of his contributions was subject to speculation. Okay, even back then, way back when, I should say, there was a knowledge that maybe we don't have everything from Hippocrates, and so do we really know exactly what he taught, or what comes from him, or what does not come from him? His fame as the ideal doctor, the ideal physician, comes from the philosopher Plato, who mentions Hippocrates in two of his dialogues. One's called the Phaedrus and the other the Protagoras, just in case you're wondering. The Phaedrus and the Protagoras. And hello, Miss Taya Soheda. Where's my pen? That there. So from Plato and also subsequent escalating attribution of medical wisdom to him. That's as they put it in the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, that people kept attributing more and more medical knowledge to this guy Hippocrates, because just everyone knew Hippocrates. So if something, if some kind of knowledge there was some kind of new knowledge in medicine or some knowledge of medicine, people said, well, where did it come from? Well, it must have come from Hippocrates. He's the famous dude. It's kind of like when you're on the internet and you find all sorts of internet quotations that are attributed to famous people, like the comedian George Carlin. and they ain't by George Carlin. They're just made up quotes that people think came from St. Augustine, because St. Augustine is such a famous thinker of the ancient world, and he would have said something like this. But no, usually you find out if you do an internet search that the quotation is bogus. The same thing kind of happens with Hippocrates. People just attribute medical wisdom to him because he's so famous. I'm not going to worry about that. This is the quote. This is the only real reference. Well, this is not real reference, but this is the only reference to Hippocrates in the Phaedrus. It's just a very brief thing where these are dialogues. These are conversations between the philosopher Socrates. Remember, I told you that people believe that Hippocrates was a contemporary of the philosopher Socrates. And Socrates is talking to this gentleman called Phaedrus. And in the context of the conversation, Socrates says, do you think you can know the nature of the soul intelligently without knowing the nature of the whole? Meaning, can you know something specifically without knowing it in its wholeness? Notice the concept of wholeness here, health. And Phaedrus says, well, Hippocrates thought so. Hippocrates thought you needed to know the whole. Hippocrates, the Asclepiad, and the Asclepiad will become apparent, or you'll understand why I have that word underlined later. But Hippocrates, the Asclepiad, says that the nature even of the body can only be understood as the whole. Why is this an important little quote? Well, because it's really our only evidence that we have, our early independent reference to Hippocrates' method, what Hippocrates people think he believed about the treatment of illness and the treatment of the body, that the body needed to be treated as a whole. Health means wholeness. So you see this idea even in ancient times with Hippocrates. So it's not a huge reference. In the Protagoras, Hippocrates is one of the characters in the dialogue. And so, probably not the real Hippocrates, but just Plato is using him as a character in his dialogue. But he is referenced in the Protagoras, and so people would know him, or at least know who he is, know that he's a famous person. But there is the Corpus Hippocraticum. As I said, Hippocrates was a semi-legendary figure. We know next to nothing about him. We don't know how much he wrote or what is attributed to him, can be attributed to him. Nevertheless, there is a body of writings to which his name is attached. Maybe he actually did write some of them. Who knows? Maybe they're just lecture notes from talks that he gave that his students wrote down, and they say this is from Hippocrates, even though he didn't actually write them. We don't know. Scholars debate, and even in, as I said, even in the ancient world, there was a recognition that even though these writings survive under the name of Hippocrates, it's doubtful he was the author of any of them. No part of the Corpus Hippocraticum can be attributed reliably to Hippocrates. This is a Latin phrase, corpus Hippocraticum. Corpus simply means body. Hippocraticum, you might assume, comes from Hippocrates. So the body of writings of Hippocrates. Corpus means body. And it amounts to around 60 treatises, 60 writings that survive under his name. And what are these treatises notable for the world of medicine? Well, the first thing to note is that they are materialistic. They reject, contrary to what was common in medicine at the time, they reject supernatural explanations of sickness and illness. This still occurs today. I lived in the country Papua New Guinea for 9 months a few years back, and I remember that the government was having to institute laws against the killing of witches. The killing of witches. This is the 2000s. And it was an issue because people believed, still to this day in Papua New Guinea, there's a widespread belief that illness is not caused by a germ, a bacterium, a virus, that it's caused by witchcraft. People say spells or do incantations and cause someone to have the flu and get sick. And they seek these people out. They seek out who in the village is most likely to be the witch, and if they find out who they believe to be the witch who's causing sickness or illness to people in the community or animals, they kill them. So the government has had to institute laws and penalties specifically for the protection of people who are believed to be witches. I don't even know if they would say they're witches, but people, the crime of killing a witch. So supernatural explanations, even to this day in the 2000s, in this millennium, in some cultures that is still an issue. It was certainly an issue in the ancient culture of Hippocrates, but in the writings, materialism, the view that the world is composed of matter alone, that you're dealing not with supernatural causes, that wasn't a denial of the gods. It's not like the Hippocratic physician denied the gods. We'll see in the Hippocratic Oath that Hippocrates certainly did not deny the gods in their work, but they weren't the causes. It wasn't assumed that they were the causes of illness. You looked for material causes based in the physical body. The second thing was an emphasis on observation, that you that you observe what's going on with the human body. You see, does a person have swelling behind the ears and stuff like that, or do they have an abscess? So you observe what's going on. This was, I guess, a novel thing, because you just don't take the illness for what it is. You want to see what the symptoms are, symptomology. So if you notice through your observations that certain things always occur when there's a certain type of illness, then you can kind of get an idea of what illness it is and hopefully how to treat it. Oftentimes in ancient medicine, you could describe what the illness was and have no idea what to do about it, or think that they thought they knew, but their prescriptions were not really correct. And then finally, the isolation of the causal factors. This would be what's called in modern medicine etiology, that you're looking for the causal factors, the sources of the illness. This ties into observation. To know the causal factors, you have to observe what's going on with the body and with the person and how the person feels. And a part of observation as well is that you talk to people, you conversation with the person. You just don't poke and prod them. You ask them, well, how are you feeling? Where is the pain? Is the pain acute? Is it quickly onset, or is it chronic? Have you had it for a long time? On a scale of 1 to 10, what's the pain feel like, et cetera, and so forth. Oh, I thought I put that quote on there, but I guess I didn't. The Hippocratic corpus became the standard against which later doctors measured themselves. And it became so popular that the Hippocratic corpus, these 60 or so writings, became the basis for Western medicine for around 2,000 years, until the onset of modern scientific method and modern medicine. So it's very influential. Hippocrates, it's very influential, and at least his ideas, as far as we can trace them, or maybe trace them. Okay, the Hippocratic Oath is a development in the history of medicine, but also in bioethics. Why? Because it's the first statement of its kind of medical ethics that we know of. It specifically addresses the ethical issues of how a physician should deal with his or her patients. In the ancient world, it would almost always be a man, so I'll say his. I'm not trying to exclude anybody. Who would like to read that for us? This first portion of the Hippocratic Oath. Anybody? Nobody? Maybe somebody? I don't have to choose somebody. I got you, Mr. Dietzel. How you about it, Mr. Saravo?
I swear by Apollo, the physician, and how do you say it?
Asclepius.
And Hygeia.
Hygeia, good.
And Panacea.
Very
and
good.
all the gods and goddesses as my witness, that according to my ability and judgment, I will keep this oath and this contract.
Keep going.
To hold him who taught me the art equally dear to me as my parents, to be a partner in life with him, to fulfill his needs which required, to look upon his offspring as equals to my own siblings, and to teach them this art if they shall wish to learn it without fee or contract. And that by the set of rules, lectures, and every other mode of instruction, I will impart a knowledge of the art to my own sons and those of my teachers and the students bound by this contract and having sworn this oath to the law of medicine, but to no others.
All the way, sir. Keep
I will
going.
use the dietary regimens which will benefit my patients according to the greatest ability and judgment, and I will do no harm or injustice to them. I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such plan. And similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary
Good.
to cause an abortion.
Very good, sir. You might as well continue on with the rest of it. You don't have to continue on. Would someone else like to read the rest of the oath? Yes, Ms. Pullman, go ahead.
In purity and according to divine law will I carry out my life and my art. I will not use the knife even upon those suffering from stones, but I will leave this to those who are trained in this craft. Into whatever homes I go, I will enter them for the benefit of the sick, avoiding any voluntary act of crime or impropriety.
Impropriety.
I don't know. Or corruption, including seduction, women, or men, whether they are free men or slaves.
Ooh.
Whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, whether in connection with my professional practice or not, which ought not to be spoken of outside, I will keep secret, as considered that such things to be private. So long as I maintain such faithful without corruption, may it be granted to me to partake of life only in the kindness of my heart, gaining the respect of all the world. However, should I transgress this oath and violate it, make me obstinate in the faith.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate it, Mr. Scrappo and Ms. Pullman. So that's the oath. Hopefully you have read the oath. It's one of the assigned readings. Well, I didn't put it up on. Well, I did put it up on. It's under modules now. But if you haven't read the oath, look at the oath. But nevertheless, I give it to you on the PowerPoint because I knew I was going to go over it. So if you haven't read it yet, that's okay. Because I've been a little bit slow on uploading things. So I'm not going to talk about the whole oath in detail, but as you can probably imagine, there are certain things that are in bold type and highlighted, or underlined rather, and those are the points that I want to highlight and to look at for the oath. It is a statement of medical ethics, of how a physician should be in relationship to his or her patient. The opening part invokes the gods, so there is clearly a religious element to the oath. You start by invoking the gods as the witnesses because the gods will punish you if you don't fulfill the oath. That's what the invocation of God is for. So you think about it in a courtroom. You swear to tell the truth, so help me God. We still have this custom in our courtrooms with the implication, at least in the ancient world, that it's supposed to, even if the other human being cannot bring about justice, if you violate the covenant or violate the pact, the God will bring justice. The God has witnessed what you said. So who are these gods that are mentioned? Well, first of all, we have the god Apollo. He's the main god, main god here, because he's a god. He's truly a god by nature, and he is considered the god of healing and purification. So doctors would be especially devoted to the god Apollo, and there's a statue of him. I don't know what he looks like. I haven't been to Mount Olympus, so I don't know exactly what Apollo looks like these days. But there's an artist's rendition of Apollo. The second name that is mentioned is this gentleman Asclepius. And I say gentleman because he is the son of Apollo, but by a human mother. So he's kind of like a human divine hybrid. Although later he does become worshipped as a god. And Asclepius is also seen as a god of healing. You'll also see his name, just so you know, as Aesculapius. Whoops, am I spelling it right? I'm spelling it right. Aesculapius. Okay, the E might be wrong. I hope not. But Asclepius is, I believe, what it is in Greek, so I'll stick with that. And here we have a statue of what it looks like. Notice the caduceus. You see that with even today we still use this pagan symbol or this symbol of the stick with a snake wrapped around it. Okay, so notice that he has this. He's holding this in his hand. It's this piece of wood apparently with a snake. Right, to I guess represent health or his role in healing. In the Iliad, in Homer's Iliad, which is just a long poem by the Greek poet Homer, he is called the blameless physician. Okay, so there's that connection with the medical arts. You don't need to know what the Iliad is. It's just a story about a battle that occurred and stuff like that. It's a long poem, and it deals with an ancient battle. But in the context of that poem, Homer, this poet, refers to the blameless physician Asclepius. Asclepius's home was Kos, just like this. Now, notice I said I would come back to Hippocrates, the Asclepiad. Kos was the home of Asclepius, and it was also the home to a group of physicians who called themselves Asclepiads, like descendants of Asclepius. Could also call them devotees or followers of Asclepius, the blameless physician. So Hippocrates is from Kos, and maybe he has some connection to them. That's why Plato calls him the Asclepiad. The other person mentioned is Hygeia, which we know her already because we use this word in the word hygiene. Okay, so washing your hands during COVID-19 was a form of hygiene, keeping yourself healthy and whole and free from germs. This comes from the goddess Hygeia, who is one of Asclepius's daughters. She's considered the goddess of health, cleanliness, and sanitation, which is public cleanliness. Okay, so there you see. Think about washing your hands with alcoholic gel, or the what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I'm talking about the gel that has the alcohol concentration in it, so it kills germs. Cleanliness. So you can think of Hygeia. Panacea is also one of Asclepius's daughters, and she is the goddess of universal health, universal remedy. So she gives remedies. She's the one you look to for solutions to illness, to curing illness. Going backwards. The doctor shall teach them this art. Well, he's referring to the offspring of his teacher in the medical arts, but there is this kind of commitment to teach the medical arts free of charge. Now you can remember that when you're taking out a HEAL loan. No? Yes? Do they still have HEAL loans? Anyways, paying off those student debts, but that was the ideal for Hippocrates, that the art should be taught free and without contract. At the bottom there, we see here the cornerstone of the Hippocratic ideal, which is that whatever you do, he's talking about dietary regimens, which would be nutrition, but nevertheless, that whatever the physician does will be for the benefit of the patient. Okay? It's for the benefit of the patient. Beneficence is what it's called nowadays. And then we have the principle of what's called non-maleficence, which is I will do no harm. So this idea of at least doing no harm, certainly doing good to your patient, but at the very least doing no harm or injustice to the patient. It's interesting for modern times to look at this because he mentions we have the issues of euthanasia and abortion that come up, which is interesting because this is such an old document. It comes maybe from 500 BC. So over 2,000 years ago, some of the years ago, some of the modern issues that we're confronting in bioethics were being confronted by Hippocrates. And he basically says, don't do them. Don't give a lethal drug to anyone if they ask you, and don't advise it, but don't give a pessary for abortion. Now, I looked up what a pessary is, and frankly, I don't know how you would perform abortion with a pessary, but a pessary, and they still have pessaries nowadays. It's something that would be placed up the woman's vagina, and it can be, and it's meant to keep the uterus inside. For example, if there's a collapse of the uterus or even of the bladder, where it's falling out of the the canal there, which it shouldn't be. It should be staying in place. You can put a pessary in place to try to keep it there. I don't know. I looked on the internet. I don't know how it would be used in the process of abortion, but apparently it could be in the ancient world. So just if you're curious what a pessary is, that's what a pessary is. It's an instrument that will be shoved up or placed up into the vaginal canal to probably keep the uterus in if it's collapsing out. In purity and according to divine law, I will carry out my life and my art. Again, we see here that there is even though supernatural causes were not sought for medical issues, Hippocrates is not an atheist. Okay, he assumes that it's what he's doing is a divine art. Primarily, we can say this because he's appealing to the gods of this art, the gods of medicine, Apollo, Asclepius, who are the gods of health and well-being. Any home he enters, he will enter for the benefit of the sick. Again, we see there that concern for the health of the patient, and that he's there not for the healthy, but for the benefit of the sick. Notice also that he says, in whatever home I go, he does not make a distinction between, as we saw in the statement of the Code of Hammurabi, he does not make a distinction between a freeborn person or a slave, a rich person or a poor person. The doctor goes into whatever home there is a sickness or an illness that needs to be treated. We have the concept of confidentiality already in the Code of Hippocrates, where he will keep secrets. Whatever he hears from his patient is between him and the patient, not between him and necessarily the family members or other members of the community. So we have the idea of confidentiality, which ties into ideas of, would that be autonomy or would it be justice? Would it be veracity? Well, I think the autonomy of the patient, that the patient has the right to make his or her own decisions, so you don't share those decisions with others. But I could be wrong about that. I might be come under another principle. But nevertheless, the principle of confidentiality is there. Panacea. Oh, and the I is in parentheses just because sometimes you'll see Panacea's name spelled C-E-I-A rather than C-E-A. Okay? Yes, sir.
Is there a reason she's on her hands? Is that true, or is that just because they fell off?
They got broken off. Yeah, I assume as much, right? Because it looks like there's a roughness here. Whoops, I did it again. There's a roughness there, which it seems to indicate that there were originally arms or hands here, but they're not there anymore. In the process of time, go back. How did I do it last time? Let's see here. There we go. All right, where are we going here? Oh, I put that quote after that. Don't know about that. The next thing we want to look at is a reading from the book. It's called the Book of Sirach, or it can also be called the Wisdom of Ben Sira. I believe that's what it's called in the Catholic Bible, the Wisdom of Ben Sira. And here we're dealing with the Bible. The Bible deals with a lot of issues, a lot of topics and subjects. It's a multifaceted book. And there is a section which deals actually with the performance of medicine and with physicians. This book of Sirach was composed in Jerusalem between 190 and 180 BC. So it's old. It's over 2,000 years old. And it was composed by a gentleman called Jesus ben Sirach. How do we know that it was written by Jesus ben Sirach? Because he tells us. If we look at Sirach chapter 50, verse 27, he tells you, I, the author of the work, Jesus, son of Eleazar, son of Sirach, wrote this work. Why is he called Jesus ben Sirach? Just go with it. Why isn't he called Jesus, son of Eleazar? Jesus is a very common name. Jesus is not unique to Jesus of Nazareth. It's a very common Jewish name. So don't get confused by that or think that, is it Jesus Christ? No, it's a different Jesus. The name Joshua is the Greek form of Jesus. Jesus is just this Hebrew name Yeshua in Latin. It's come down to us in Latin. Ben means son of in Hebrew. So scholars, when they refer to him, biblical scholars will usually keep the Hebrew form and say Jesus. They won't say Jesus, son of Sirach. They'll say Jesus ben Sirach, just so you know. Okay, so I'll stick with that. And this is a picture of an ancient copy of the text that was found in Hebrew. It was first written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. And until modern times, we actually only had the Greek version, but they started finding Hebrew texts, presumably of the original Hebrew, the original that the Greek was based on, back in the late 1800s. Okay. So Sirach is rare in the sense that it's one of the few works of the Bible that was actually written by the person to whom it was ascribed. Most of the time, we don't know who wrote anything in the Bible because it doesn't tell you who the author is. But in the book of Sirach, it tells you who the author is. And it's one of the longest books of the Bible, and it contains the most extensive portion of Israelite wisdom literature to come down to us. Wisdom literature is just a fancy term or terminology used to describe books or writings that deal with the practicalities of living everyday life. They're usually filled with maxims or sayings that people can use to live life. All right, wisdom. They're dealing with human wisdom. How do you live life? And so it's literature, so it's called wisdom literature. So Sirach since it's one of the, as you might assume, since it's one of the longest books of the Bible, contains the most extensive portion of this kind of literature. So it contains a variety of proverbs, sayings, advice, usually for young men. It's usually it's written in the form of a father giving advice to a young man about how to live life, especially, okay, son, you're going out to college, let me give you some pointers on what to do and what not to do, stuff like that. Or my daughter, you're going to the university, let me tell you, what you need to look out for and what not to look out for. The same kind of idea. And these proverbs and sayings and advice are given on all sorts of subjects in daily life in the book of Sirach. There's really no kind of general outline to the book. It's almost like what popped into the guy's head. Oh, I want to say something about how you deal with women, because it's talking to like his son. So how do you deal with health? How do you deal with being rich versus being poor? How do you deal with social relationships? Okay, and so it's kind of all over the place in terms of topics. But in chapter 38 of the book of Sirach, we have this. And would anyone like to read this section from the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, chapter 38? Let it be, da 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 da. Nobody? Gonna make me do it? Well, I got it in my bones, I guess. All right, I'll read it. Chapter 38, make friends with the doctor, for he is essential to you. God has also established him in his profession. From God the doctor has wisdom, and from the king he receives sustenance. Knowledge makes the doctor distinguished and gives access to those in authority. God makes the earth yield. I wonder if I can turn this so I don't have to. Whoops, whoopsie doodle. There we go. Now I have to put on my eyeglasses. Hold on one second. Okay. God makes the earth, verse 4, God makes the earth yield healing herbs, which the prudent should not neglect. Was not the water sweetened by a twig, so that all might learn his power? He endows people with knowledge to glory in his mighty works, through which the doctor eases pain, and the druggist prepares his medicines. Thus God's work continues without cease in its efficacy on the surface of the earth. My son, when you are ill, do not delay, but pray to God, for it is he who heals. Flee wickedness and purify your hands. Cleanse your heart of every sin. Offer your sweet-smelling oblation. Oblation simply means an offering. Your sweet-smelling offering and memorial, a generous offering according to your means. Then give the doctor his place, lest he leave. You need him too, for there are times when recovery is in his hands. He too prays to God that his diagnosis may be correct and his treatment bring about a cure. Whoever is a sinner before his maker will be defiant towards the doctor. So, and I'm presuming nurses as well. So if you ever have an ornery patient, you can remind them of you. If you're a sinner before your maker, sir, you're defiant towards me. Let me put that IV in you. Okay. Although we should preserve our health, there is a time when sickness strikes and the services of a doctor are needed. Okay, remember I told you before, in the ancient world, it could be dangerous to be a doctor. People didn't always want doctors to be around because they associated the doctor with illness and death. But the vision of Sirach is different. He puts it in a positive light. And this is from a commentary, the Jerome Biblical Commentary. It says, quote, this bit of common sense that go to a doctor when you're sick, this bit of common sense, self-evident to us, constituted a problem for some of Sirach's contemporaries, who looked upon consultation with a doctor as a lack of confidence in God. Okay? Pray to God, he'll heal you. Yes, God is your healer, right? So just pray to God and he'll heal you of your disease. You don't need the physician. To go to the physician could be seen as an act of pride. Sirach says no. The physician is an agent of God. The author extols the role of the physician and explains what is the appropriate procedure for consulting him. In verses 1 through 3, you see that Sirach says the physician should be treated with deference, with respect, since he is a minister of God. In fact, in the Greek text, that was based on the Hebrew text, the original Hebrew text, the translator said that the doctor is created by God for human need. He is ektisen, created. That's his purpose, or her purpose. I mean, that's a weighty word because remember, God creates the world. God makes creatures. We are creatures. A doctor is a creature of health. The physician's wisdom, which comes from God, should not be ignored. God is the source of this, so it's really looking towards God. You're not looking towards, to those who might say, well, you're being prideful, you're being insulting to God in a way by going to a physician and hoping that he will heal you rather than God will heal you. No, Sirach is turning that around and saying, the wisdom that the physician has to heal you, the healing which comes through the physician, is coming ultimately from God. And so, and not just from the physician, but also medication. It deals with medication as well. In verse 4, you see, God makes the earth. If God, the doctor is a creature of God, so he has the knowledge of the healing art, but also the created world is created, the created world, okay? The created world is a creature of God as well. So the drugs that we find, the medicinal herbs that we can use, they're not there for no purpose. They're not there for nothing. All right, so in verse 4, the author points out that the prudent will not hesitate to take medicine, which is another of God's gifts. Verse 5, just which you might not immediately know you might not know the context, so it might not be immediately apparent what verse 5 is referring to, was not the water sweetened by a twig. It's referring to an episode in the life of Moses, this great prophet and lawgiver Moses in the history of the Jewish people. And there's an episode in when the Jews are traveling through the desert, where they come across a source of water, but the water is brackish, it's salty, which of course means it's you can't drink it. I mean, you can drink it, but it won't give you much benefit. In fact, it will be bad for you. So Moses is told by God to throw a piece of wood, a stick, into the water, and miraculously, hallelujah, it turns into sweet water. It turns into fresh water, so that people can drink it. So that's what Sirach has in mind. He's saying, from a piece of wood, okay, and you kind of have to just go with this example because it's not exact. But from a piece of wood, brackish, salty water was turned into sweet water. In the same way, I guess herbs coming off of a tree or something like that can be worked by the pharmacist, by the druggist, into a healing medicine and be something good for the body. I mentioned that yet? No, I'm not there yet. So verses 7 and 8, not just the doctor is praised, but we have here an early reference to pharmacists. I don't think we have anyone who's doing pharmacological sciences here. I don't know if we have a pre-pharmacy program at Gwynedd Mercy, but nevertheless, be respectful also of the pharmacist. The apothecary, the druggist, and the physician are both providential instruments who are carrying out God's healing work. But what's the proper attitude? The physician comes from God. His knowledge and her knowledge comes from God. The healing art is given to the physician from God. So, but how should you act towards the physician, or what should be your attitude in a period of sickness? Well, verses 9 through 11 kind of give you an example. First, before consulting the physician, it recommends, while it grants the necessity of a physician, it's not saying don't go to the doctor, but before that, one should still pray when sick and perform other righteous exercises, because ultimately it is God who heals. Then go to the physician and seek his or her help. So note the order. First, you cleanse the soul, because from Sirach's perspective, you are a unified composite of both body and soul. It is the body is sick, yes, but the soul might be sick as well. You offer prayer and sacrifice to God and then consult the doctor. So in other words, confidence in God, this is from a commentary that I consulted, again, the Jerome Biblical Commentary, quote, confidence in God does not exclude common sense. Okay? Yes, are things called faith healing, where you can go to a preacher or somebody and they place their hand on your forehead and they say, be healed in the name of Jesus. Okay? And I'm not saying that healing doesn't occur. But also, you might want to get a second opinion from a physician, just to be, because that might be the avenue that God is sending you. Think about the old joke about the guy who's in the flood, and he says, "Oh, God will save me," and the guy comes along in a boat. "Hey, get into the boat, you'll drown." No, God will save me. I'm going to stay here. then eventually the flood is, higher. So the guy's up on the roof of his house. They come in a helicopter. Hey, get in. We'll send something down. We'll get you into the helicopter. Look at where the water is. You're on your roof. No, God will save me. And eventually the guy drowns and goes to heaven. And, says to God, why didn't you save me? The flood was there. I kept waiting for you to save me. The guy said, God is, you can imagine what the punchline is. I sent you a guy in a boat and I sent you people in a helicopter to save you. What more do you want me to do? Okay. I sent you the doctor to save you. Yes, go to the faith healer. That's certainly not saying don't do that or don't pray for healing, or go to mass and have a mass said for healing or something like that. Go to Lourdes and bathe in the water there, the miraculous water, and maybe you'll be healed. Might happen. But certainly you want, Sirach recommends the little bit of common sense of going to the physician as well. Verses 11 to 15, the physician must be consulted also as God's appointed means of cure. He is, so from Sirach's perspective, God has appointed the physician as the means for your cure, even though it is ultimately God. And even the physician depends on God and must pray to God. Now, Sirach is a Jew. He believes in one God. He doesn't believe in Apollo or Asclepius. He believes they're false gods. They're non-existent gods. Nevertheless, we see from the Hippocratic Oath that first, the physician, before taking the oath, prays to the gods and even completes it. Excuse me, I shouldn't say completes it, but first prays to the gods that he will have the power to perform his healing art and perform it well. Sirach has the same vision. The physician relies on God, and if you are defiant towards the physician who comes to you in the name of God, you are defiant towards God himself. Now we come to this, and I wonder, this is rather longish. I might just comment on it and not read the whole thing. But the Charaka Samhita, it's also called the Charaka Shapha, which it means oath. Because bioethics or ethical treatment by medical professionals is not just a Western thing. You might think that there's a focus on the Hippocratic Oath and Hippocrates, and think that because of that, other cultures did not have points of view on medical ethics, but they did. And so I want to give you one other example that I found, which comes from India. And as I said, you see here on the PowerPoint, it's a rather longish quote, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just want to highlight some points. You can read it for yourself if you want to. It supposedly comes from this physician, Charaka, or it might also be pronounced Charak with the final A silent, but I'll say Charaka. And the Charaka Samhita is a collection of medical writings from ancient India. It's part of, India has a traditional form of medicine called Ayurveda. And a lot of cultures have this. Usually when we think of traditional medicines or alternative medicines, we think of Chinese medicine. People will talk about that, or things like acupuncture. But actually, a lot of ancient civilizations have their own views of medicine as well, which are similar in some ways. And in India, they called it Ayurveda. So that's the context from which Charaka is coming. And what we have here from the Charaka Samhita is a kind of oath that a student would take who is beginning the process of learning medicine. The medical teacher is kind of like a guru in a sense. All right, a guru is just a kind of a religious teacher, and the student will present himself, and in the process of entering into the medical field, the guru, the teacher, would tell him, these are all the things that you are supposed to do. This is how you're supposed to comport yourself. This is how you're supposed to treat patients. Okay, so it gives them a little summary of what the medical profession is all about. So first of all, day and night, However you may be engaged, you shall endeavor for the relief of patients with all your heart and soul. Okay? Now, this is very similar to statements in the Hippocratic Oath, where the physician is supposed to commit himself to doing no harm to the patient, to doing good to the patient and doing no harm. But this is more of a general thing, that your whole heart and soul should be committed to your patients. You should not desert or injure your patient for the sake of your life or living. The reference to adultery is, again, think of what Hippocrates says in the Hippocratic Oath about not seducing a patient. These are still ethical issues. You have gynecologists who can rape and sexually molest their patients. You are in a doctor or physician is in a power relationship with a patient and can do things sometimes to a patient that are unethical, but also gravely immoral. So this is not a modern issue. Sometimes you'll see it on the news, of a doctor who did something to a patient, sexually molested or sexually assaulted a patient. This is not new. Okay, we find this in Hippocrates. We find this here in the Charaka. But notice number 7. Whereas Hippocrates, this is a cultural difference, I guess, but also an ethical difference. Whereas Hippocrates says that whatever house you go into, you're there to treat the sick. Hippocrates makes no distinction. There's no boundary of, okay, this person is treatable and this person is not. But there is that boundary in the Charaka Shapath, in this oath, that people who are hated by the king, so the insurrectionists or people who are political enemies, or hated by the public, or who are haters of the public, shall receive treatment. Those who are extremely abnormal, I don't know what he means by that, or what the book means by that. Could that be the mentally disabled, mentally disabled, or the physically disabled? I don't know. But those who are extremely abnormal, wicked, of miserable character or conduct, those who have not vindicated their honor, so they're cowards in a way, those who are at the point of death, and similarly women who are unaccompanied by their husbands or by a guardian. These people should not be treated by the physician. All right, so there's a difference of view here. In modern times, I think that most physicians would consider these kinds of restrictions in themselves unethical. That you treat, the cops bring someone in who's been arrested, because of some horrific crime that they did. Well, you don't treat them if they need treatment. If you're a physician or a nurse, no, of course you would treat them. You treat the patient. You're not treating what the patient did or why the patient is there, even if they're handcuffed to the bed. In Charaka's mind, no, you wouldn't treat the person. The reference to not treating women, this just bears some comment. This is not necessarily anti-woman or misogynistic, but you have to remember that from the ancient perspective, if a woman comes to a doctor, the doctor may need to touch her, may need to see parts of her body, like the genitals, that are uncomfortable, okay, and stuff like that. And in some cultures, especially ancient cultures, this might be considered inappropriate, especially for a male physician. There's too much danger of there being, of crime being committed or immoral actions. So it doesn't say that a woman cannot be treated by the physician, but that she should be accompanied by someone, a protector. So mainly not so much for the woman, but for the sake of to keep an eye on the doctor, to keep an eye on the physician. In fact, in some Asian cultures, I remember seeing this on television. I think it was like on one of those antiques shows where people bring in antiques and they want to sell them. Someone brought in a little doll which had all these little points on the body. It was a female doll of a nude woman, but it had all these points. And the appraiser, explained what this was. This was a doll. It was a way for a doctor to treat a woman without having to physically examine her, because it might be considered inappropriate. Again, you don't want a man touching the woman in certain areas. So you could point at the doll at the specific points about, okay, and have her show the doctor where is the pain, on this I think it was ceramic or something. It was made out of, it wasn't made out of wood. It was made out of like a ceramic mold, and that's how. So indirectly, the woman could show the physician where the pain was or where the problem was, so the physician did not have to physically touch the woman. So there is a protective element here. Entering a patient's house. Number 8, having entered, I'll skip down to the portion that I have highlighted because that's important to me. Having entered a patient's house, the physician's speech, mind, intellect, and senses should be entirely devoted to no other thought than that of being helpful to the patient and to the things concerning him. Again, we see a correlation with Hippocrates' maxim of doing good to the patient. You are there for the health of the patient and the benefit of the patient. And that's about. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about Charaka. Number 9, I guess the only thing I was interested in was the science of life medicine, which is a good definition of what medicine is. It is the science, the knowledge of life, of giving life to others and helping them have a good and healthy life. Okay, so that's from the ancient world of some ethical points that come up. What has gone on historically in recent times, or various historical developments? Most of them you'll see are from recent times, because bioethics develops in the modern world, and oftentimes the need for bioethics as a field comes from these problems that develop specifically in modern times. Negative events usually. For example, there's a picture of Karl Brandt, who I believe was Adolf Hitler's personal physician, who is there on trial for experiments. The Nazis used their concentration camps to perform all sorts of experiments on human beings, mostly without the consent of those human beings, and sometimes resulting in the death of those human beings, depending on what kind of experiments they did on them. We also have in the United States the Tuskegee syphilis study, which occurred from 1932 to 1972. There's a picture. They didn't even try to hide it, that they were doing it. They had pictures, just like the Nazis didn't try to hide their experiments. They had all sorts of their research. They had reams of files about what they did and stuff like that to see how various diseases or illnesses progressed. And we have here a man injecting or taking a blood sample from this gentleman in performance of the Tuskegee experiment, which went on for 40 years. And they would have probably kept doing it if someone didn't find out about it and leak it to the press. And I'll talk about Tuskegee later. Yes.
Is he in a different country? Where is he like?
No, this is in the United States.
Well, like, was it a big deal? Was it like a scandal or something?
Oh yes, oh yes, it was. It's still. That's why it's still mentioned. Oh yeah, it was a huge scandal. It went on forever. Well, I should say forever. It went on for a long, long time. You can see the dates, 1932 to 1972, and they only stopped doing these experiments mainly on black men, by the way. They specifically chose African Americans to do this study of syphilis. We'll talk about it later, but on the progression of the disease of syphilis. It was a medical reporter found out about it and leaked this. I shouldn't say leaked the story because he was a reporter, reported on it, and that's how it ended. But it did not end voluntarily. Oh yeah, it was a big scandal. But they knew about it. About the Tuskegee, well, again, with the Nazi experiments and with Tuskegee, which was here in the United States, they made no secret of what they were doing. They had pictures, they had their research. In the case of the Tuskegee experiment, they published the research in journals. They made no secret about what the purposes of, that they were not actually treating these gentlemen for syphilis, but they wanted to see how syphilis would make them die, and they could chart the course of the disease. They were open about it, so it was a big scandal. Bioethics came about because of these urgent cases. Mainly, it came from putting out fires. What do we, as these various scandals or certain events came about, the Nazis or Tuskegee or Japanese Unit 731, which was another during World War II, where a Japanese military unit would experiment on human beings. This was another one. Um, you know, people wanted answers. What do we do in these situations? What should have been done? So you're kind of like putting out fires. You're coming in after the fact and putting out the fire. It was not reflective of systematic problems. It was not reflective of problems that were going on in healthcare. It was as there were problems that were coming up. And so you have developments like in regards to, say, the Nazi experiments. You have things like the Nuremberg Code in 1947, and later on in 1964, you have the Declaration of Helsinki, which is in Finland, which was created specifically. These are mentioned in bioethical history because these were created specifically to deal with the putting out the fire. What should have been done in the case of the Nazis with their experiments? Nobody knew about Tuskegee yet, so they weren't worried about that. They were mainly focused on Nazi Germany and what was done in the concentration camps. So the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki were created to provide doctors and researchers with ethical guidelines. They started to realize that in the life sciences, we need some ethical guidelines about what we should do and what we shouldn't be doing. Because the Nazis were doing the experiments just because they could do them. There wasn't any ethical concern or any ethical questions raised. Could you do what was being asked of you? Yes, so you did it. And you were doing it on prisoners who had no rights, so they couldn't complain about it or object, or they were just simply non-humans. In the case of the Japanese Unit 731 experiments, they referred to the patients as logs, like logs of wood. They were just like logs of wood to them. They could do whatever they want, even vivisection, meaning they could dissect them while they were alive, which they did, without anesthesia. Ooh, good times. No, bad times. Bad times. Shame on you, Dr. Dunn. Okay, so there were discussions about another development, and I know I'm hop skipping and jumping over things because I'm going to want to go with dates and major points that develop in the history of bioethics, how we get to actual bioethics. And these two events are where we get to more of a formal need for bioethics. The institutionalization of bioethics, okay, were the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, were they bioethical in a broad sense? Yes, because they're dealing about ethics with the life sciences, but that wasn't their main focus. They were dealing with research and how to conduct research in an ethical manner. There's the need for research on human subjects, but ideas of respect for the human person, that they have informed consent to what's going on, that you tell them everything that's going to happen, even adverse effects that might happen. What kind of information can you withhold from them, like if you're using placebos and whatnot, and control groups. That's what they're concerned with. They're not concerned with, say, the bioethics per se. But once we get to the foundation and the institutionalization of bioethics, like for these, and with these two institutions, we're getting to where we want to go. 1969, we have the foundation of the Institute of Society, Ethics, and the Life Sciences, which is also known as the Hastings Center, and there's a picture of the building, which might be reverse. I think it should go the other way. But anyways, doesn't matter. And in 1971, you have the foundation of the Joseph and Rose Kennedy Center for the Study of Human Reproduction and Bioethics, okay? Here, right there in your face, is the word bioethics being used in the name for this institution. The shorthand name for the institution is the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, but these are the first two academic institutions that were founded to specifically conduct research in medical ethics and to publish journals on the subject. So, for example, in the case of the one, you have the Hastings Center report, and in the case of the other, you have the Kennedy Institute of Ethics journal. Okay? So they're specifically geared towards the question of ethics in the life sciences. So these are two significant developments in bioethics emerging as a field. And as I told you, I think I told you in the previous class, yeah, we date from around the 1970s when bioethics starts emerging as an academic field, mainly because of these developments. 1970, you have the publication of a book, a groundbreaking book by Ramsey called The Patient as Person, Explorations in Medical Ethics, where he argued that there was a serious and urgent need for thinking about moral issues in medicine. Not that there wasn't thinking about that before, but it kind of, some things take off and some things don't. I mean, were physicians thinking about ethical issues before? Yes, they were, but he helped. His book helped create a new academic discipline of medical ethics, which we would call bioethics. Then 1971, we have the word being used. Now, remember, Fritz Jahr used it way back when in the 1920s. So this man, Van Rensselaer Potter, did not create the word, but he brings it to the consciousness of people by writing this book, Bioethics, Bridge to the Future in 1971. So that's another development. It gets people thinking about, there's a broader field of ethics in the life sciences, which includes medicine, but can also include other things. I think I have a. 1932 to 1972, we have the Tuskegee syphilis study, which brings again to people's consciousness the need for ethical guidelines in research, but also the ethics of how research is done. It was a syphilis study, and you can see there's a definition of what syphilis is: a chronic contagious disease caused by a bacterium that's often related to sexual intercourse. You can be born with syphilis. A pregnant woman can transmit syphilis to her fetus, but most of the time it comes through sexual intercourse and presents with ulcers, which are open wounds, or open sores, I should say, a rash, and lesions, which are wounds, just a fancy term for wounds. And there are different stages to syphilis. Third stage, there are 3 stages to syphilis, which is actually a 4th stage because there's a latent stage in between the 2nd and 3rd stage where the syphilis seems to go away, but then it comes back. So it's kind of, it kind of, gives you a brain freeze. It's 3rd stage syphilis, but it's really 4th in the progression of the disease. The 3rd stage syphilis can damage internal organs and cause death. So it's a serious illness, and it's fully treatable. It was fully treatable for the men in the Tuskegee study once they discovered penicillin, but they weren't given penicillin. And I think because it's now, just want to make sure about my time. Yes, there we go. So it's 10:40. I'm not going to be able to cover the whole thing in 5 minutes, so I think I'll end with this and come back to it on Tuesday. So have a good day, good weekend. Good to see you all.
That's great. That's great. I was about to say the attention to detail.
This.
You said